So as a brief introduction, Mary Beth Pfeiffer, author of Lyme, the first epidemic of climate change, has been an award-winning investigative journalist for 3 decades. Since 2012, she has become the leading U.S. investigative journalist on the growth of and controversies surrounding Lyme disease, a hidden menace that, she argues, has been fostered by a warming world while being vastly underestimated and poorly managed by American medicine. In Lyme, the first epidemic of climate change, Pfeiffer documents the human contribution to the dangerous spread of Lyme disease to dozens of countries, as well as multitudes of people. In a book based firmly in science, author Mary Beth Pfeiffer shows ticks climbing mountains and crossing borders as temperatures rise and ecosystems are altered. As important, Pfeiffer challenges medical dogma that has left many untreated. Lyme makes a powerful case for action to combat ticks, address patient pain, and recognize humanity's role in creating an epidemic. For her Lyme reporting, Pfeiffer was honored with a half-dozen awards, including the prestigious Sigma Delta Chi Award in 2013 from the Society for Professional Journalists, one of her 2 Sigma Delta Chi Awards. Please join me in giving a warm welcome to Mary Beth Pfeiffer.
Does everybody hear me? Yay, okay. As I said, I have a slightly different presentation, very low tech. I'm all text. I speak, as my book, I hope, does, in words. It tells a story, and it tells a rather sad story about where we are with tick-borne disease in the 21st century. And you've gotten a great deal of good information here. I've learned a lot. But you're going to get something else, I think, from me. You may get mad if you aren't already. Here we all are in Halifax, Nova Scotia, at a Lyme disease conference. There's no Lyme disease in Nova Scotia, right? There's none I'm sure, in Saskatchewan and Manitoba and on and on. We hear this in the south of the United States. We hear this in California. We hear it in Colorado. The Brits are told there's no Lyme disease there. Australians who are, lining up at doctors' offices are also told there is no Lyme disease in Australia. Sometimes it's even true. There's not Lyme disease everywhere, maybe not in the middle of the desert. But for too long, and at great harm to patients, and some of you may be a patient, Lyme disease has been minimized. It's been molded by American medicine. It's been closely controlled. Doctors have been told you can fairly easily diagnose Lyme disease. You can pretty readily treat and cure it. And they believe this. I'm an investigative reporter, and I started in 2012 to look into Lyme disease. It took me a while to get around to it because I didn't view it as an investigative story at the time. I didn't see in it the type of, corruption that investigative reporters look for, or injustice, or malfeasance, that sort of thing. I also didn't think that Lyme disease was all that, big a deal. I thought it was a nuisance disease. I didn't think it was life-threatening and life-changing. And boy, was I in for an education when I got into Lyme disease. It was indeed a huge investigative story. There were all the elements there of a story that needed to be exposed of injustice mainly to patients. So here's a bit of what I found as I started down this journey of looking into Lyme disease. Right off the bat, I found people with the disease who had gone to 10, 15, 20 doctors and were unable to get care. They were told they had multiple sclerosis, fibromyalgia, rheumatoid arthritis, often depression, anything but Lyme. I found doctors who were under investigation who dared to treat these people with, of all things, antibiotics, which is a pretty safe drug. I found people who were told they did not have Lyme disease when they had all the signs of it. Sometimes when they even had the erythema migraines rash, the red rash. Sometimes when they even had a positive test. There was a lot of denial. There's no Lyme here where they were. So I found delayed diagnoses. I found tests that failed. I found people who were treated but who didn't get better. And I found guidelines that were sorely lacking, the guidelines that basically governed care of Lyme disease. And that was just the first story. So from there, I did about a dozen more, and now a book. And basically, I'm an outsider in the Lyme world. I don't have chronic Lyme disease. I don't have it in my family. I'm a journalist, and a journalist with a very long history of writing in-depth, very detailed articles that have stood the test of time, that have not been challenged, that have been proven accurate. So that's how I came to Lyme disease, as an investigative reporter. And as that kind of reporter, as the outsider who did the research, who talked to many, many people, scientists, doctors, researchers who read a ton of science, I'm here to tell you, if you've gone through the Lyme disease ringer, that medicine has gotten this disease wrong. And if you haven't gone through it, beware. The ticks are out there. Consider this a warning. Okay, lest I scare you totally to pieces, the news isn't all bad. On the plus side, many people are quickly diagnosed with Lyme disease, and they are easily treated with antibiotics. It's usually those who are lucky enough to get and see the rash. I know this because I was one of them twice. I live in the Hudson Valley of New York. It has among the highest Lyme rates in the world. The problem, though, is for a large population of other people. There are people, many thousands of them, who don't quite fit into the model of Lyme disease as it is fashioned and framed by American medicine. That model is flawed. So we are here facing two very big and very much connected trends. First, we've got the rapid spread of these ticks. We saw that on the maps that were shown here. They arrived in Nova Scotia in 2005, and look where they are, all over the place. Black-legged ticks today are in twice as many counties in the US as they were just 20 years ago. And we know they're knocking at Canada's door, and they are well over the threshold, and they are moving north. The second of those two trends is that doctors don't know how to treat these diseases, Lyme disease in particular, when it gets out of control. They don't know how to treat when you get 2 or 3 pathogens in a single tick bite. And this is probably the biggest problem. They haven't been told there's any problem at all. So in my title, I call Lyme disease the first epidemic of climate change. And it's a pretty heavy title. It should sort of scare the wits out of many of us because there are billions of ticks moving around the planet. This isn't just happening in the US and Canada. Ticks are climbing latitudes. They've been verified to be climbing mountains in the Alps. They're moving into Scandinavia. They're moving into China, Russia, as I said, Australia. They're all over Europe. They're in South America, as is Lyme disease, and some of these related co-infections. Now, migrating birds have carried ticks south to north for thousands of years. We know this. But just a few years ago, when a bird would carry a tick along the Atlantic flyway, say from South America or even from the east coast of the United States, and drop it into Canada, it would die there. No more. Now, these ticks find a mouse or a deer, or sometimes a person, on which to have a nice meal, and more disturbing, they find another tick who also wants to keep the species going. So the reason for this rather sudden habitat explosion, as my title says, is pretty clear. The world is warming. It's a wonderful place to be a tick today. A great place for a mama and her 2,000 babies. Ticks love the weather these days. In New York, where I live, where we once had fierce snowstorms for 3 months out of the year, we sometimes see ticks year-round. Day after Christmas a couple of years ago, I picked about 20 ticks off 3 dogs who I had taken for a walk. That's amazing. But it's not just caused by climate change. I'm not putting all the blame onto climate change. Lyme disease existed out in the environment for many millions of years. We know that. We've seen ticks embedded in amber that actually have the corkscrew-shaped spirochete inside. But we sort of let this happen. We unleashed this army of ticks by warming the planet, but also by managing it in the way that we did. It's a product of the suburbs and the cut-up forests. It's a product of fewer species, one keeping the other in check. In New York, for example, we have tons of mice that the ticks feed on and get infected by, but we don't have very many foxes anymore. And the foxes ordinarily would have eaten those, gobbled up a lot of those mice, and so we wouldn't have quite such a huge reservoir to impart Lyme disease. So basically, this epidemic is really a perfect storm of a warmer and unbalanced planet. Okay, so all of this wouldn't be so bad if we could control any of these factors, if we had a vaccine against the diseases that ticks impart. It wouldn't be so bad if American medicine had geared up like it did when the AIDS epidemic emerged, spent the money, done the work, and tried to find some answers. This was not done for Lyme disease. Instead, a kind of folklore built up around Lyme disease. It was repeated in medical journals, and it was hailed by the US Centers for Disease Control. It goes like this. We know how to diagnose Lyme disease. We know how to treat it. We know how to cure it. The bigger epidemic, and this is a quote from a prominent physician about 20 years ago, is Lyme anxiety. So these are the myths of Lyme disease. And before I get to the myths, I'm just going to share a quick story. It's not in my book. There were just too many to fit in there. But it's of a young boy who was going on 13. He lived on a farm in a northeastern US state. He had 2 brothers and a sister. He was a big kid, a football player. Then he started to get sick with some regularity. And he was often given antibiotics, which sort of kept things in check. He didn't thrive, but he functioned. Then the flu swept through the family, and the boy got very, very sick. He was left in a fetal position. Over the next weeks, his parents took him to the state's best hospitals and doctors. He lost the ability to walk. His weight fell from 182 to 113 pounds. He was having pain unlike anything he had ever known. So he struck out physically and verbally, which was when doctors took a different approach. Doctors said to the parents, do you get along? Do you fight in front of the kids? Do you have money problems? They suggested, as sometimes happens in such cases, that the boy's pains and problems were in his head. So he was put on psychiatric medications and sent to a psychologist. At this point, the boy's story takes a turn. The psychologist concluded there was nothing she could do. The problems of this child were beyond her ability to help. But then she asked an offhanded question. Had they thought about Lyme disease? No, they hadn't. It turns out an assistant in her office had a disease with very similar symptoms. And quite remarkably, the parents began to hear other stories. Their insurance agent had gone for years undiagnosed. There are two injustices to this story. The first, of course, is that no one even thought to check if the boy had Lyme disease. He lived in a state where Lyme disease was known, but no one thought to look because of the way Lyme disease has long been viewed in American medicine. No big deal. It certainly didn't look like what this boy had. The second injustice to this boy's story is that it took an odyssey to find, care for, and fix this child. Consider you had two terrified parents. They bring their son to a highly regarded children's hospital, to a top medical center, yet they're offered only psychiatric drugs and other pharmaceuticals that clearly were not helping. I jumped forward here. So, watching their son suffer, they made a scary decision. They walked away. They turned instead to a doctor in New York they'd never heard of. It took many trips to this physician. It took near financial ruin. $100,000 was spent out of pocket in intravenous medications. It took 5 years, but the child did get well. He went to college. He graduated with honors. Ultimately, the outcome was good, but I'd ask, at what cost to him and his family? And what of the children, many of them, without that kind of family support? I'm a parent. I have to ask myself, would I be able to do this? No parent should have to. Now, that was 20 years ago, but this kind of thing still happens today. In America, folks travel far and wide when they can't find treatment at home. And because of the influence of American medicine, it happens in other countries too. In England, I interviewed a man who flew to California to get treatment for Lyme disease. I spoke to a Swedish woman who flew her daughter to England. I spoke to Australians who flew to Cyprus, Canadians who traveled to New York, Connecticut, and other places. This is nonsensical, it's expensive, and it's harmful to patients. Here in Canada and in many other places, there are people suffering the lingering effects of Lyme disease. They can get painkillers, they can get steroids and antidepressants, they can get lots of tests and diagnoses for other physical and psychiatric ailments, but they cannot get care for late-stage Lyme disease because medicine doesn't accept that it exists. When help is most needed, patients find doors to treatment closed. My suggestion on those closed doors and why I wrote my book, let's open them. Now let me explain why this happens. It goes back to the myths of Lyme disease. Number one myth, the test works. The test for Lyme disease is a little bit like asking a woman if she's a little bit pregnant. Either you are or you aren't. Not so much for Lyme disease. There are hurdles to mount. People out here probably know some of this. You have to have certain antibody loads. You have to have special markers and a certain number of them. One scientific paper I read called the test complex, technically demanding, and costly. It said it was able to diagnose early cases less than 40% of the time. It said a simpler, more objective test was needed. And this is a study that has been used by the CDC to defend the test. More on that later. So I read 300 scientific papers. I think I alluded to that. But my book doesn't read like a science journal article. I want to assure you of that. It's easy to read. But that was a lot of science. I'm just going to read you one sentence that might have been the most gratifying and revealing from all of those studies I read. 21 researchers looked at 78 studies of how well the Lyme tests worked. They wanted to come up with sort of a consensus. This is what they concluded. The data in this review do not provide sufficient evidence to make inferences about the value of the tests for clinical practice. Translation: we can't really say if the test works when a doctor uses them on a patient. 21 researchers, 78 papers. We've known this about Lyme tests for years, but for years they've been defended by the Centers for Disease Control, by the Infectious Diseases Society of America, the group that wrote the Lyme disease guidelines, by major medical journals that have repeated and reinforced the CDC and IDSA dogma. The folks in those powerhouses of medicine share a belief system about Lyme disease. They go way back and they think they're right. But their official picture of certainty is being challenged. It's being challenged by people like you. It's being challenged in the medical literature. And make no mistake, it is changing. It will change, as I'll explain. It's just not changing fast enough. Doctors still have no other choice, as they have since 1994, but to use the only approved test for Lyme disease. So here we are with, to put it mildly, a tricky test. But instead of focusing on the patients that the test fails to diagnose, American medicine has been preoccupied with the patients who are wrongly diagnosed. Overdiagnosis, the second myth of Lyme disease. Since the early 1990s, there have been at least 30 scientific publications that have been devoted to the overdiagnosis of Lyme disease. The very first paper, which led to what I call a good deal of copycat science, found more than half the tests that were positive in one laboratory were negative in another. That's a pretty big discovery. Isn't that a clue, though, that the tests are unreliable, confusing for doctors, variable by lab? You might think so. But instead, the takeaway for doctors has been, be suspicious of a positive test. Tread lightly. Don't falsely diagnose. This is part and parcel of a tamp-it-down mentality that has characterized this disease. 15 months ago, my niece tested positive for Lyme disease. She had plenty of antibodies. She got an A+ on all those markers that you have to have. But no, false positive, her doctor said. He didn't treat. She didn't get better. This is how Lyme dogma plays out every day in medical practices everywhere. She recently went to another doctor, tested positive, and is on antibiotics, but 15 months were lost. So I told you 30 papers on overdiagnosis. I found 5 that discussed underdiagnosis. This is a disease that once it gets out of control is very difficult to get back under control. So for years, a strange paradigm has ruled Lyme disease diagnosis. It goes like this. Okay, the powers that be say, the test works, but not if you use it too early. That's when the rash will tell you you have the infection. But of course, the rash doesn't always appear. It doesn't always look like it's supposed to look, like the red on the outside, clear on the inside. And you may just miss it. Okay, say the powers that be. The tests work, but they may show an old infection because antibodies, as we know, hang out in the body sometimes for years. As my niece was told, old infection, go home, you're not sick. Okay, the tests work, say the powers that be, but not until later on in the disease. You have to wait a while. Let the infection progress. Then we'll test you again. This is one disease you don't let fester. It's not smart, it's not safe. The Lyme bug is very crafty. It quickly leaves the bloodstream, goes into the cartilage, drills into the muscle and into various organs. It covers itself with coatings that drugs cannot penetrate. So it wreaks havoc another day. I talk also in my book about a boy named Troy. Troy's an adorable kid, thick blonde hair, loved to do these bebop dances for his 4 older brothers. When he was 10, he was diagnosed with Lyme disease and briefly treated. A few weeks later, he got very sick. Couldn't get out of bed, throwing up, headache, fevers. He dragged his foot behind him, which is a known symptom of Lyme disease. After a week in a hospital, doctors diagnosed him with something called pain amplification syndrome. It was in his head. One doctor even called it schoolitis. They gave him antidepressants when he was released from the hospital. I read Troy's records from when he was in the hospital. Many tests were done, but doctors did not pursue Lyme disease or any other tick-borne disease for that matter. His mother tried to tell them he'd been treated for Lyme disease. Quote, they never wanted to hear another word about it. A couple of other dozen mothers have told me very similar stories. In Australia, a woman told me she never mentions Lyme when she brings her daughter to an emergency room. It's too controversial. Now, Troy's story didn't happen 20 years ago, as with the farmer's son I told you about. It happened in 2016. It happened in Connecticut, the state where Lyme disease emerged in the late 1970s, where this disease is known, where it's common. But here and everywhere else, Lyme disease is viewed as a straightforward, curable illness that doesn't get to the stage that Troy's disease was. This is the fallacy of our view of Lyme disease. This is why doors are closed. A doctor put it this way for Troy's parents as they stood in a hospital hallway, desperate for some news on their very ill son. They told the doctor that an outside doctor thought Troy might still be suffering from Lyme and other infections. Firmly and with great certainty, the doctor said this: there is no such thing as chronic Lyme. These supposed Lyme disease experts are a dime a dozen. All they want is to take your money. I would just add something here. These supposed experts, as the hospital physician called them, are doctors who are treating a patient population nobody wants. The doctors who are risking their licenses, not just in the US, but in other countries. They're figuring this out alone with little help from mainstream medicine. They're sometimes called quacks because they give longer-term antibiotics, mostly judiciously and mostly with probiotics. Consider that antibiotics are among the safest drugs there are. They are used in long courses for things like tuberculosis, urinary tract infection, acne even. And their overuse is undoubtedly a legitimate issue, especially in livestock. But for some reason, a line has been drawn on Lyme disease. And it is based on outdated science that medicine has wrongly and fiercely clung to. So this brings me to my third myth. This one holds that the infection can almost always be eradicated, that short courses of antibiotics kill the Lyme bug. At Tulane University, there's a terrific scientist named Monica Embers. A few years ago, Dr. Embers infected several monkeys, small monkeys with Lyme disease. She treated 3 of them with doxycycline and waited a few months, and then she put ticks on the monkeys to see if the ticks would become infected, much the same way as ticks that bite mice in the wild become infected. Sure enough, when she pulled off those fat and gorged ticks, she found live Lyme spirochetes in 2 of the 3, in ticks from 2 of the 3 monkeys. The bugs had survived. This was a very significant finding, but it's not the only one. At major universities, scientists have virtually done backflips in their efforts to kill the Lyme spirochete in test tubes. They've tried common antibiotics, the kind that are used on you and me when we get infected. They've tried them in different combinations. They've tried very strong antibiotics. But each time, something called persister cells survived. Does this sound like a bug that's easy to kill? This is what one of the authors of one of those studies said. Interestingly, when you show up at the doctor's office, nobody tells you that you have a 10% probability that something very unpleasant is going to happen to you. And maybe we won't have a remedy for that. We'll just give you some doxycycline and you'll be fine. A lot of people are not. As I was writing this speech, a new paper came out in a European journal. It's a kind of review that is meant to sum up for busy doctors what they should do about Lyme disease, what the treatments are, how to diagnose it, and it repeated the myths of Lyme disease. It said the tests work, in brief, and the short courses of antibiotics cure. But that paper, what it didn't say, was more interesting to me. It made no mention of this new science. 20 papers in the last 5 years. Science showing that the way we treat Lyme disease may not be working, that the Lyme bug survived in Dr. Ember's monkeys, in all those test tube experiments, and in mice, in gerbils. We've had other experiments over the years that have shown the same thing. This is the influence of Lyme dogma. Made in America Lyme dogma is not all wrong. It's just too black and white. Yes, some people are falsely diagnosed, but I frankly don't see much of a problem with it, even in the medical literature or in reality. And yes, many people do recover after a couple of weeks of doxycycline. These patients, however, are the lucky ones. They're the ones who were treated at a golden time. These are the Lyme disease patients around which these myths of Lyme disease have been fashioned. The simple, straightforward, Lyme-only cases. And yet, every year, thousands of people remain ill after being treated exactly as the medical guidelines advise. Instead of rushing to their aid, medicine is running the other way. So a few years ago, Bill Gates gave a talk about malaria. He's worked hard, God bless him, to help eradicate this awful parasite around the world. So he was speaking to people in an auditorium much like this. Malaria kills 500,000 people a year, he told them. Quote, "There's no reason only poor people should have this experience." So then he unscrewed a jar and let loose about a dozen mosquitoes. The room erupted. Gates assured everyone that the mosquitoes were harmless, no malaria in them, but he made his point. Things that fly can be scary. This is problem number one, the threat. Ticks don't fly. They climb a foot or two on a bit of brush, and then they wait like this. We saw a picture. Their legs outstretched. We've got all day, they think. There's billions of us, a few of us are bound to get lucky. So just months after the Zika virus erupted in 2016, the CDC gave out $184 million in grants. Now, Zika is and was a serious threat. Babies in South America, we saw the pictures, were born with horribly deformed heads, and the virus had turned up in Florida. But the same year, the CDC gave $2.7 million for Lyme disease. That year, 360,000 people were infected, and the CDC has long acknowledged that 10 to 20% of them don't get well after treatment, at least not for weeks, months, sometimes years. A few years ago, a healthy man in Maryland suddenly became ill, confused, and delusional, and incontinent. He was 76, so he was thought for weeks to have a form of dementia. Then a doctor checked for Lyme disease. The man was cured with antibiotics. That made him wonder, though, about other people whose doctors don't think to check for Lyme disease, as many don't. Would they, he asked, be put in some kind of facility and just waste away? Somewhere, I'm quite certain, there are such people. There was a 29-year-old man who lost his memory, began acting strangely, and was diagnosed for 10 years with schizophrenia. A team of doctors took another look. After 6 months on a strong intravenous antibiotic, the man got well. His problem wasn't schizophrenia, it was Lyme disease, and the solution was far outside the short courses of antibiotics in the Lyme guidelines. I would add here that antibiotics have their limits. They don't always cure late-stage Lyme disease. A lot of people know this. The problem is that medicine has not tried to figure out what does. Instead, it denies that a problem exists. Sometimes medicine gets it wrong. When Teddy Roosevelt was a boy, his asthma was treated by having him sit in a room filled with cigar smoke. This was common in the early 1900s. No one thought ulcers was caused by an infection until H. pylori was identified in 1982, and it was treated with antibiotics and cured. The challenge faced by Lyme patients has no parallel in American medicine. Across the nation and around the world is a huge patient population that can't get care. They meet in hundreds of Lyme support groups. They know the pain and pitfalls of ticks. There is outrage and frustration among these people, and I hope you're not one of them. I hope, though, through my book, to stoke a little bit of the outrage that these patients feel. I hope to have it spill over into the wider world, to warn other people that ticks are out there, that they're on their trail, their nature trail, they're in their backyard, they're in many places where their children play. Children can no longer roll in the grass or run through a field. We need to know the dangers that are out there, and we need to get this message out to the wider world, because we, frankly, do not have this epidemic figured out. Thanks very much.